Hello and welcome back to the fourth part, the next step in your identity management journey. My name is Walid Mir. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer specializing in Azure infrastructure, security and compliance, security operations, AI, and Copilot courses. I'm here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. In this session, we're unlocking the power of Microsoft Entra Connect, the essential solution for synchronizing your organization's on-premises Active Directory with Microsoft Entra ID in the cloud. You'll discover how Entra Connect enables seamless management of users and groups, supports hybrid identity scenarios, and ensures secure, unified access to resources across both on-premises and cloud environments. Whether you are modernizing your infrastructure or supporting a hybrid workforce, this session will equip you with the knowledge and tools to bridge the gap between on-prem systems and cloud. Let's get started. Now, to understand how Microsoft Entra Connect works or what is it used for, let's have a look at the whiteboard and discuss some details. If you are looking at a scenario where you already have an existing on-prem environment, typically somewhere on-prem, you'll have some sort of a resource like a server that somebody would manage, ideally more than one, but in this very, very simple setup, if you look at a physical server on your environment, now this server would require you to install a Windows operating system or a server operating system, if you like. That should be configured in here. Now, based on your Windows server environment, let me rewrite this all and configure this as a server. So this is a server and we are installing a server OS. Now, again, like I said, as an example, could be your Windows server. Now, after you've installed some of those details, you'll simply go into configuring your directory services or enabling that role for that server. And once you have the directory services configured, this is where you will have access to your Active Directory in your environment. Now, if this is a current setup that you already have with either a simple setup as this or with a cluster of servers and other details configured in your environment, you might already have quite a few details going on in your environment. Things like your users already that exist in your organization, some groups that you are working within your organization already, maybe devices that you are managing that are part of your on-prem setup. Now, if I am looking to move into the cloud and have a cloud presence or have a hybrid environment where I want some resources to be on-prem and others to move into the cloud, one of the first things that we would need to do is go and configure Microsoft Entra ID in the cloud. Now, I might already have that if I have already configured any of the cloud offerings for the likes of M365 to allow my users to log into the M365 solutions. They would already have an Entra configured in the backend, and they would already need to be in a hybrid state. Now, for me to do this, I don't need to recreate them again under my Microsoft Entra ID. What we can do is use a solution over here or tool over here called Microsoft Entra Connect. Now, we'll come back to variations of Entra Connect and the different methods that you can use in how it manages your authentication. But before that, let's talk about on how it will work. Typically, you will have to configure this Entra Connect onto your on-prem resource on the server that you have your Active Directory running. And this will then help you sync all the resources from your Active Directory into your Microsoft Entra ID. Now, typically, this is a one-way connection. Again, depending on the type of methods that you choose, that means anything that I have on-prem can now be seen in the cloud. For instance, if I go with an example of a user one that existed on-prem, this user will then have a hybrid identity and they will also exist in the cloud as well. This means that while they log into their device on their laptop and they use their login name details that they use on-prem, they will be able to sign into the device. Once they are signed into the device, they can simply open a browser in here and type in office.com. Now, them typing in office.com, this is a cloud resource. this should typically take this user to Entra to say, hey, Entra, do you know of this user? To authenticate this user for me to log in. Now, if this user is already synced from your on-prem using Entra Connect, the Entra will have visibility of this user, and Entra would be able to say, hey, I know this user, and would be able to either help you in some way authenticating this user. We'll talk about different methods just in a minute to confirm what that looks like. Once that's done, then this user will be able to log back into office.com as a authenticated user. Now, this is something that we'll look at using Entra Connect with that we'll be able to do. Now, these errors are deliberately in one direction. Again, like I said, for most cases, this is how the system would work. You do, however, would like to enable certain features that could help you in managing your resources in the cloud. For example, things like writeback feature that you can enable for your devices or for your passwords that you might want to configure in this environment. Now, what does that help me with? Well, for instance, the user that we had for U2, U1, this user that we mentioned, imagine this user logs into the device, opens the browser, goes into office.com and logs into the office. Now, while they're in the office portal, they go into the settings and change their password. Now, that password change has happened in the cloud because they're logged in to a cloud resource, but hasn't changed anything on their on-prem under Active Directory. Now, if I don't enable the password writeback feature, then in that case, this user's password would not be written back down onto my on-prem setup. This user will need to now manage two passwords. And this is, again, something that you don't necessarily want your users to be working with, to remember multiple passwords so they don't get confused with some of that. So again, a writeback feature here would help, which will write down the details of any changes to do with passwords on-prem, and the user will be able to work with that. Now let's jump onto the portal and have a quick look of where Entra Connect is and discuss different methods of us working with Entra Connect. Right, I'm back into the portal and looking at my entra.microsoft.com, my Entra Admin Center. Now within the blades of my Entra Admin Center, if I scroll down to the bottom, I should see Entra Connect as one of the options for me to look at, so I can go and configure this. If I had an on-prem setup and I'm looking to now bring in some of my on-prem settings to the cloud. Now here I get to see two different options that we are looking at to configure. I have a variation of different types of Entra Connect that I can use. One of them is called Entra Connect Sync and the other one is called the Cloud Sync. Now, if you want to know the difference between both of them, you can simply go into reading the information that's listed on the screen over here, or sometimes it's better to jump onto the Learn documentation that can give you a more detailed information about this. By all means, you can have a look at that video clip to understand what this is all about. All I'm going to do is scroll down to the bottom of the page and have a look at a very nice table that defines certain features that are available from one or are different from one to other, or maybe available in both. So it's nice to see this. For example, as a very, very quick information about both of them, the Cloud Sync is typically what we refer as a lightweight solution that we can use, that you can configure on your on-prem server for you to be able to manage it from the cloud. Typically, your Connect Sync would be installed on-prem on the server. However, you manage that from that server, not in the cloud in Entra. So again, that's a very, very high level understanding of that. However, there are many other things to look within. For instance, here it tells me that, hey, Cloud Sync is a lightweight agent that you install in your environment. Again, it has some other features that you might want to look at if you're looking at multiple disconnected on-prem AD forests and you want to manage them and connect to your Entra. You can, but only if you are using Cloud Sync. My Connect Sync doesn't have some of those features available. Now, if I scroll further down, again, there are quite a few other options you can look through. One of the key options that I want to highlight right now is the different methods that we are going to discuss in the next part of the session to understand when we configure them using Entra Connect, what happens. Now, it's good to know that my Connect Sync allows me with all of these options. However, my Cloud Sync doesn't like the middle option, which in this case is pass-through authentication. So it's good to know about that. And again, like I said, you can always go down and compare other things that are available for you to look at within this environment to understand exactly which tool will work for you, or do you need a bit of both, or do you need one of the two to work in your environment. Just nice to look at some of the documentation to understand some of that. Now, if I was to configure any one of them for my environments, I don't necessarily have a hybrid or on-prem environment, which I want to convert into hybrid right now. But if I did, then obviously I'll have to come down in here and download my Entra Connect sync from in here, and then go and take it to my setup and install it. And if I was to use, again, the Cloud Sync, I would do the same. Come back down here and look at the agent that I want to install, and simply go and configure that agent by simply downloading that agent from the menu here and configuring it onto my on-prem setup. Now, this brings us to the next part of the discussion of, once I have decided which solution works for me best, either if it's the Cloud Sync or if it's the Entra Connect sync. Once I've decided on which solution is what I need to, during the configuration of this, also define what type of methods is it going to use in terms of authenticating the users that I have on my environment. Users that are coming from on-prem into the cloud, how do they authenticate? Typically, there are three key areas that we can talk about in this. One of them is called password hash synchronization, and we can look at synchronizing your hash values of your passwords that live on your on-prem into Entra in the cloud, which is again a very secure method of doing that. Or you can look at other two options where you can pass through the authentication down to your on-prem, or a federated solution where you hand off this authentication method to, again, an authentication provider that you might be working off with. And this is, again, these are, again, some of the options that we have in our Entra Connect. Let's have a little bit more discussion around them so we can understand the needs and different use for some of these solutions that we have in our environments. Let's start first with password hash synchronization and understand how this works for me in my environment. Now, like I said before, when we are talking about password hash synchronization, what you're looking to do over here is, on your Active Directory, all the user details that you have, for example, username and passwords, it will create a hash value for these passwords. It takes an additional step for adding some more secure details using SHA-256 encryption to further protect your hash values, and connect using Entra Connect to sync them into the Entra. So it will simply sync these hash values for you in the cloud. Now, the advantage of doing this is, if my user that sits over here types in, for instance, office.com, the first thing this will do is the user will bounce to Office, and the Office from here will say, hey, go and authenticate to Entra so I know who you are. If Entra already knows this user, because Entra can go back and check, hey, I've seen this user right here. This is a user that's come in from on-prem and it's in a hybrid state. This is a point where Entra would need to understand what authentication methods are configured for this user. If this is a password hash synchronization, that means there's a hash value already available for Entra to take. Now, at this point, it can ask this user to authenticate if they already haven't done so. And if this user provides, for instance, a password, in the backend, Entra will convert this password to a hash to see if the hash value matches to the hash that Entra already has for this user. And if they match, Entra will simply send information back to Office to say, hey, log this user in, they're authenticated, and there's nothing to worry about. Now, a couple of other things to understand. This authentication happens in the cloud and not on-prem. If after the first sync, my on-prem setup is down for a temporary period of time, this user might not be able to log into any on-prem resources. However, if they were to type back in a cloud resource like portal.azure.com or office.com, they will still be able to log in because their authentication is happening in the cloud. And if their on-prem setup is down, that doesn't stop them from logging in to their environment. And in short, this is your password hash synchronization. Now, typically when you're configuring this on your agents, on your environments, during the setup or configuration of your Entra Connect, this is where you will see an option to choose authentication methods for the users that are signing in into your environment, and they should be able to choose one of these options. So far, we've already spoken about the password hash synchronization, and we are going to look at the other two just in a minute. So you have to choose which one of these authentication methods are you going to use for the user to authenticate. Now let's jump on to the second scenario. If I was to use an option to configure as for my Entra Connect to go through pass-through authentication. Now, what happens in this scenario? First of all, let's understand what do I need in terms of implementing this particular type of solution. For my on-prem setup, for my Active Directory, I need at least 2 different authentication agents to be implemented. Now, it will work with one. However, just for redundancy purposes, we require at least minimum of 2 to be configured in your environment. These agents are responsible for taking any requests that are coming from Entra to authenticate a user. So you must have these configured in your environment. So it requires a little bit more in terms of configuring on-prem rather than just installing and configuring Entra Connect. Now, apart from that, if we carry on with the user and start saying, hey, the user tries to go back into the Office resources, Office bounces them back to say, hey, go to Entra and configure or authenticate yourself. Entra now sees the list of users that it has and say, hey, I know this user. This user is part of my setup, but this user is configured to be pass-through authenticated. In that case, this is when Entra would send this information out to on-prem. Now, typically this information will be received by the authentication agent. And again, they will look into verifying this user from the Active Directory that you have on-prem. So the authentication for this user happens on-prem. Now, if you, for any security reasons or any scenario, require the authentication process to not happen in the cloud and happen on-prem, then password hash synchronization might not be a solution for you. You might look at pass-through authentication, which then passes the authentication process to happen on-prem, and this is where the users will authenticate themselves on-prem and not in the cloud. Once all that is done, this can simply send the information back to Entra, and in return, Entra can send the information back to your Office or the cloud resources to allow you to have access to them. This is pass-through authentication. Now, the last part that we are going to look at, or the last option that we are going to look at, is called the Federated Authentication. Now, why do I need this, and what would be the benefit of me implementing this? Now, this could be that I am completely passing on my authentication process to a third-party company that handles that for me, or my company has multiple organizations and they want all of these to have a centralized authentication managed from one particular location or one particular setup that they have. And for that reason, they want me to pass through this authentication, or in fact, in this case, send this authentication to my federated servers that could be centrally managing all of that for me. Now, this setup requires a little bit more in terms of configuration and your admin effort, simply because you are going to be now not just looking at creating your Active Directory on-prem that you should have. You're also looking at creating a federation servers that are going to be managing some of this information for you. And to allow the connection coming from outside world, you would need to configure at least 2 proxy federation services in here as well that will handle that request coming through and forward that to your federation servers that you have in the backend. Now, this is a little bit more complex than pass-through authentication, where we just have 2 agents. This requires you to have at least a few more services running in your environment, requires a little bit more management. Obviously, you're configuring more resources, so troubleshooting and management of those comes along as part of that, and maybe slight more cost because you're now running multiple solutions or multiple services in your environment. So if you're looking for a solution, again, that does not require a user to authenticate in the cloud and on-prem, this could also be another solution for you. So we have pass-through authentication and federated authentication that could have the user authenticating on-prem. However, if I was to compare this to pass-through authentication, this requires a little bit more admin effort and might have a bit more cost than using pass-through authentication. And with that, we come to an end to this session. Congratulations on completing the Implement an Identity Management Solution module. You have just explored the core of modern identity management, learning how to create and manage users, groups, and devices, mastering the Microsoft Entra ID, and enable secure collaboration with external and hybrid identities. You now understand why licensing and custom security attributes are essential for every IT professional. Remember, identity and access management is at the heart of every secure organization. The skills you've gained here will help you protect resources, empower users, and support seamless collaborations no matter where your team works. Ready to take the next steps? Keep learning, keep practicing, and become the expert your organization relies on for secure, efficient identity management. This concludes our session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.